Hey everybody, how you doing? So when I was asked to speak at this event, the organizers asked what they would like me to talk about. So I'm used to being asked to speak about first-person shooters or programming, and especially my time in id Software. But for this talk, the conference organizers wanted to hear something more. They wanted to hear my story, my history in the game industry. So there's something more than that, though. Through my story, they wanted to kind of hear the industry's story, basically the game's story. Where we started, where we have been, where we are, and where we are going. And having been in the industry since 1987, that's no small amount of ground to cover. So I've done a lot of thinking and looking at my archives and a lot of talking with friends. And a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about today is about my story. And in thinking this through, this retrospective has illuminated a lot of patterns and patterns I hadn't really seen before, and patterns I'll share with you in this talk that show us just not where we've been, but where we as a game industry are probably going. So for that, and for giving me this tremendous opportunity to look back as well as to look forward, I'd like to thank you all. And now I'd like to talk with you about the story told in my book, Doom Guy, Life in First Person. So I grew up in the desert of Tucson, Arizona. I was born Mexican and a Native American from the Yaqui tribe on one side of my family, and my great-great-grandmother was an Aztec. The other side of my family was part Norwegian, and my great-great-grandmother was Cherokee. And I grew up near San Javier del Bac, which is an old mission on the Yaqui reservation that my family went to on Sundays. My uncle was a minister there, and my family was very Catholic. And I don't normally talk about my upbringing, but I think it formed an important part of who I am and factored into the games that I made. So my mother and father, they married quite young, and while my family is now known for programming and design, it has also known tremendous success in dealing drugs and drinking vast amounts of alcohol. And unfortunately, death. 3 of my family have been shot and killed due to drinking and drugs. And my father even held up a Circle K at gunpoint for my diapers. And I don't say any of this to disparage them. My family and my culture is why I have a deep appreciation for fun, laughter, and entertainment. For as long as I can remember, everyone in my family barbecued almost every night over mesquite wood that we got out of the desert ourselves, telling stories and drinking until midnight when the coals were finally ready to cook over. And in saying this about my dad, I loved him very much. He passed away from alcohol and drug addiction in 2005 on the same day that he was born at age 57. And he didn't leave much behind. My mother eloped with my father over her racist father's objections, even though his ancestry had Cherokee blood. And I spent my first 8 years growing up in the desert on the south side of Tucson, Arizona, in the Mexican barrio. And my family was not at all into games for entertainment. I played in the dirt, in the desert, with the local animals. So if I wanted entertainment, I had to make it basically out of nothing. But in 1976, a Pong console materialized in my grandmother's house on a black and white TV. And it was mesmerizing to see something that I controlled move on a TV screen. It was the first time I played a video game, and I was 8 years old. And in 1976, I discovered pinball in an arcade named Spanky's in Tucson. It was dark, cool, and had about 30 pinball machines in there. And then one day, they put this cabinet against the wall opposite the pinball machines. It was called Dune Buggy. And one look inside the cabinet through the glass told me this was new and amazing. It used a black light, and it looked really surreal. I'd never seen a game look so interesting before. There looked like what appeared to be a ghostly Jeep that I drove around a landscape trying to avoid the car on the road. And they use this Pepper's Ghost trick that's used in the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland. And at this time, my wandering through the deserts of Tucson came to an end as my parents got divorced, and my mom found a new husband after a year or so, and then we moved out of Arizona. And it was still 1976 when we moved to Rockland, California, which was a sleepy suburban town of about 6,000 people. And unbeknownst to me, it was very close to where much of the work in the early game industry would begin. There were some nice places in Rockland where arcade games were beginning to appear, and all the games were about shooting aliens or asteroids, Space Invaders, and asteroids were pretty huge games at the time. And at that point, the computer game industry was still very, very early. The first wave of computers were out. The TRS-80, the Commodore PET, and the Apple II. And the computer game industry was started on these three computers, but mainly the Apple II computer, which had colored graphics, it had sound, and it was the birthplace of many of the games, the genres that games developed along. And the Apple II also influenced the next wave of home computers, but they wouldn't come along for a few years. Some of the earliest games on home computers started appearing in the few new software stores in 1977. The earliest games were on cassette tapes before disk drives were available on the Apple II in 1978. However, I was still playing with Tinker Toys, Lincoln Logs, and Erector sets. I had no idea that home computers existed. I was just a normal kid going to primary school. I played down by the creek with my brother and my friends like any other normal kid. Played lots of Dungeons and Dragons. We rode our BMX and dirt bikes everywhere without helmets. It was a really great time I'll never forget. And then one day in the summer of 1979, my brother and my friend Robert rode to my house, and excitedly, they told me that there's this place where we could play games that didn't cost any money. So I got on my bike and I followed them. It was about a 45-minute bike ride all the way to Sierra College, which was the community college in Rockland. And it was the summer of 1979. Outside, it was 38 Celsius, and a few students were on campus. So we made our way to the computer science building, where it was a balmy 18 Celsius. And in one room, they had Burroughs computers and Wang computers, and no one was using them for some reason. But in one room, there was an old mainframe computer taking up all the space. In the room right next to it was filled with about 25 terminals, all connected to the mainframe. And this is where a few college students were doing some of their projects. So Robert, my friend, showed me some old university text games like Hunt the Wumpus, NIM, Poison Cookie, and several others. And we came back almost every day that summer, and it was amazing that none of the students questioned the fact that two 11-year-olds were playing around on the university mainframe terminals. Sometimes, if the terminals were all filled up, we played games on a teletype machine, which is basically playing a game where every turn is a computer printout on paper. So after the glamour of the text games wore off quickly, I started to pay attention to what the students were doing on the terminals. Robert told me that they were writing programs. So I started to ask students what the words meant on the screen, and I wrote them down and started to experiment with them on my own. And before long, I had an HP Basic manual and started writing my very first adventure game. And so the summer was over, but my interest in programming computers was piqued. And by the summer of 1980, Sierra College opened up a new room, and they filled it with Apple II computers. So I spent the next couple summers going in and programming them. I was also telling my new stepfather all the cool things I was learning. In 1980 is also the year I started spending a ton of time in arcades. Every week, new arcade games were being released. It was like a Cambrian explosion of game design. It was just a wonder to behold. I played all the new machines when they came out, but I spent a majority of my time around this game, Pac-Man. The first time I saw Pac-Man was at the Foothills Bowling Center in Auburn, California. It was brand new, it was color, and you didn't kill aliens with a ship. You were a yellow mouth chomping dots with 4 colored ghosts chasing you around the maze, trying to stop you. If you ate a power pill, you could turn the tables on them. It was mind-blowing. Like, the audio was incredible, with a background siren that served to keep you alert in case being chased by 4 ghosts wasn't tense enough. The intermissions with music and humor happened pretty often, and it was such a game changer, and for me, it made an immense impact. I saw that games could be about much more than shooting aliens with a ship. More about shooting later. So in 1981, I started high school at Roseville High, which was just the next town over. In 1982, my parents finally bought an Apple II computer. And so long story short, I spent the next 5 years learning how to code and developed dozens of games. And I'm not kidding you when I say I spent every spare hour programming during that time. I loved summertime when there was no school and I could code from 8 a.m. until midnight every day. And at the start of 1983, my family moved to England. So the industry had basically partially burned down between 1983 and 1984 when the Atari 2600 market crashed. Consoles were totally dead. Home computers continued on after several good publishers went down because they were connected to the Atari 2600. Of course, the Nintendo saved the console industry in 1985. Did you know this wasn't even the first console industry crash back then? There was one in 1977 that was caused by too many Pong clones. So during this time, I submitted dozens of my games and utilities to industry magazines and software publishers. I have a stack of rejection notices that remind me of my first taste of failure. In fact, it wasn't just a taste, it was a buffet of failure, and it wouldn't be my last. And I barely graduated high school, but I learned how to code in 6502, and I wrote 51 games by 1987. I published most of them while in high school, and I got the cover of a magazine 3 times. So by 1987, the game industry had passed its Big Bang phase, I call it. Games were still being made, mostly written by indie developers and published by the likes of Sierra, SSI, EA, Origin, and many others. But internal development at publishers had begun as they looked to professionalize their businesses and have total control over the teams that were making the games. But it was the end of the 8-bit era when I got my first industry job at Origin Systems in 1987. Ultima 5, Origin's then current project, would be the last developed on the Apple II platform. After 8 months, I left Origin to co-found my second game company, Inside Out Software. After porting Might and Magic 2 to the Commodore 64, my next project was canceled by the publisher. So it was as clear as the Apple II's beep that the 8-bit era's death spiral had begun. So I left my second game company. I co-founded my third one. It was called Ideas from the Deep with a friend of mine, just before we landed jobs at Softdisk in Shreveport, Louisiana. So it was the end of the 80s. And after working so hard during that decade, writing 56 games, everything I had done was finished. The 8-bit market was done. I had to start all over again in 1989 on the PC, which was a computer that was totally new to me. And at that time, the game industry was undergoing a major switch from 8-bit to 16-bit. All the old platforms were dying as the PC, the Super Nintendo, and the Genesis were rising. And I wasn't alone in this massive shift in the industry. Thousands of programmers either made the leap to the next generation or they got left behind. MobyGames.com is populated with the credits of programmers whose work ends in the 80s. So it's 1989. SimCity was released this year, along with Populous and Prince of Persia. These games were the beginning of amazing franchises that would last decades. Yeah, this is my favorite picture. I worked at Softdisk for a year or so before starting a game-only product called Gamer's Edge. I hired John Carmack and Adrian Carmack into the group, and we started making games in August of 1990. A lot of things happened in August of 1990. First, Ultima 6 and The Secret of Monkey Island were released. Ultima 6 was the first Ultima developed on the PC, which really signaled the death of the Apple II in the 8-bit market. Monkey Island was a revolutionary adventure game. They were both amazing games. And while beginning to write our first game together, which is called Slordax, Tom Hall would pop in at night and he would help with levels because he just couldn't help it. He was too excited to know that games were being made just a couple offices down the hallway from him. So I would take breaks from coding and I would play Ultima 6 and Monkey Island, and while looking up to the success of these games as a goal that I really wanted to reach someday, Only the right conditions would present themselves. So while making our games at Gamer's Edge, John Carmack discovered the smooth scrolling tech while reading Michael Abrash's Power Graphics Programming, the graphics book that I gave him. And so after a huge breakthrough in horizontal scrolling technology, we created a PC version of Super Mario 3's first couple levels complete with the enemies, the Tanuki suit, and the fireballs and everything. And Nintendo loved it, but they decided against going forward with us. They wanted to keep their games on their platform, on their hardware. So instead, we decided to create a new game called Commander Keen that would be published by Apogee Software, a shareware game publisher. We had to create 3 games for Keen to be a success, not just one game. And because we needed to do this as fast as possible for a Christmas launch, we had to design the game to be an engine that worked on multiple data sets. So 3 months and a lot of pizza and Diet Coke later, and we shipped the first Commander Keen trilogy. It was uploaded to the Software Creations BBS in Massachusetts, which was the biggest gaming BBS in the United States. Now, it's important to note right now that it's the end of 1990. And before starting on Commander Keen, I had worked 10 years, just about 10 years, trying to make the best Apple II games I could, and that 8-bit industry died. And less than 2 years after starting over on the PC, I had made my best game. So it was the best game that any of us had made in our careers, and it was a tipping point for us. We were no longer following behind the industry, we were beginning to lead it. And so as PC Gamer noted in January of 2016 in an article titled The 50 Most Important PC Games of All Time, Commander Keen put id Software on the map, and Commander Keen's groundbreaking smooth scrolling on PCs was a revelation in 1990, and it's hard to believe today that the NES was back then capable of things that the PC couldn't do. Looking back, I'm totally humbled to have a game of mine included in this list for the year 1990 when Secret of Monkey Island was released. We were the only 2 games noted as being important in 1990 by PC Gamer. So, we quit working at SoftDisk after getting our first royalty check. So id Software was officially started on February 1st of 1991. So in May of that year, John decided that he wanted to try his hand at making his first 3D maze game. Tom Hall came up with the design for Hover Tank 1. John was really stressed getting the game made in 2 months, but he got it done on time. In the summer of 1991, we held what we called the id Summer Seminar, and Apogee, our publisher, brought many of their authors over to our lake house. We demonstrated our new Commander Keen engine technology and gave them lectures on how it worked. And some of those authors licensed our engine, and the modern engine licensing biz was born out of our lake house. In September, we moved the company from Shreveport to Madison, Wisconsin. And there were only 4 of us, so that was really easy to do. Last half of the year, we made another Commander Keen trilogy using that tech that we had licensed. And while working on our second Keen trilogy, we decided to make another 3D maze game and call it Catacomb 3D. This time, the walls were texture mapped, and it made a huge difference. This was the first nice-looking implementation of texture mapping in a game. The first example was in a 1985 game called Alternate Reality: The City. So just before Christmas of 1991, Keen 4 was uploaded to the Software Creations BBS once again. And during this time, the Super Nintendo was doing phenomenally well. John Carmack and I used to play F-Zero competitively a lot. Nintendo just now launched a Battle Royale version of F-Zero with 100 people in it. Super Mario World was also another favorite game of ours. We also played a lot of Dungeons & Dragons. So we began working on the third Commander Keen trilogy titled The Universe is Toast. We made a VGA parallaxing demo to see how it would look. And while making this demo, John, Adrian, and I decided that we did not want to make another Commander Keen game. We wanted to make another 3D maze game that was better than Catacomb 3D. So we spent 4 months creating the shareware episode of Wolfenstein 3D. During that 4 months, we moved the company to Mesquite, Texas in March of 1992 because it was just too cold in Wisconsin. Well, we finally got id Software its own office. It was a tiny loft apartment. It's like a one-bedroom apartment in Mesquite, Texas. We all lived in the same apartment complex so we could walk to work. We uploaded Wolf 3D on May 5th of 1995 using a modem. We uploaded it to Software Creations BBS as usual. Scott Miller and George Broussard were over at our apartment while we uploaded. We knew it was going to be big. In fact, Scott Miller just visited me in Galway just 2 nights ago. So Wolfenstein 3D was released just 6 weeks after Ultima Underworld. 3D gaming was just beginning on the PC, finally. So earlier in January, Dune 2, the prototypical real-time strategy game, was released. 1992 was shaping up to be a really great year for games. At this time, virtual reality was trying to happen. Dactyl Nightmare was the premier VR game and was very low-res and choppy. An outfit in Kentucky wanted to adapt Wolfenstein 3D to VR tech, so Tom Hall flew to their studio and he helped them adapt it. It was still the experimental stage of VR, so it didn't go anywhere. Interestingly, there was controversy after Wolfenstein was released, mostly here in Germany. You see, a majority of the imagery in Wolfenstein 3D is banned in Germany. The game was immediately put on the ban list, and then it was sold illegally under the counter in stores. Other interesting news with Wolfenstein was that Jewish kids loved playing the game because they felt they were getting revenge for their ancestors who suffered in World War II. Amazing. And still another interesting effect of Wolfenstein was that a Vietnam War vet got cured of his nighttime flashbacks. And we got a CompuServe message from him, and he was so happy to have found the game. PC Gamer's 50 Most Important Games article included Wolfenstein 3D, along with Ultima Underworld and Dune 2, and we were the only 3 games noted as being important in 1992 by PC Gamer. So we discovered that pushing technology and using it with great game design was really a winning strategy. And by the end of 1992, the post-Wolf 3D explosion of popularity really made up our minds. Our next game was going to be the most amazing game that we could envision. It would be hard to make, but we wanted to make the best game that we could imagine playing. So even before starting to work on the game, we decided on the name, Doom. We knew everything tech-wise that we wanted to put in the game, and like idiot savants, we put out a press release that told the world that Doom was going to herald another technical revolution in PC programming. This is the opening paragraph of the press release. The rest of it describes the game. And there's a quote from John Carmack in it that says, "Wolfenstein is primitive compared to Doom. We're doing Doom the right way this time." So another incredibly important paragraph in the Doom press release is this: an open game. So when our last hit, Wolfenstein 3D, was released, the public responded with an almost immediate deluge of home-brewed utilities, map editors, sound editors, trainers, etc., all without any help on file formats or game layout from us. So Doom will be released as an open game. We will provide file formats and technical notes to anyone who wants them. People will be able to easily write and share anything from their own map editors to communications network drivers. So the entire year of 1993 was filled with so much experimentation. Until then, we had not experimented too much in our game development. We just made the game, usually in 2 months. Experimentation happened while making the game. And we didn't put a hard deadline on shipping Doom. It's done when it's done was our motto. We knew how to ship games fast. Not having a deadline wasn't going to slow us down. We were driven to ship games. And at this point, we knew that we were in the lead. There would be no games with newer tech and better design creeping up behind us. We were building something we had never seen before. And we first started feeling invincible just after Wolfenstein 3D was released, and Doom's development really reinforced it. The invention of the BSP tree was desperately needed, so Carmack did it based on Bruce Naylor's research. 3D level design needed to be taken to the next level. Up to that point, games in 3D had a lot of limitations, so they didn't look great, and Doom changed that. So coming up with the best design took the entire time. We removed several elements that didn't matter. We said goodbye to the concept of lives and score. We had to create an idea of how the game should feel and reinforce that with visual and audio design. Multiplayer mode with co-op and deathmatch had to be created. There were no PC games available that were multiplayer and fast. Doom's deathmatch mode changed everything. So we released Doom on December 10th, 1993, and the world of 1994 was surreal. We were on top of the world. We felt that we had created the greatest game that we could imagine, and we felt the world agreed with us. Coming back to the game industry, another really big game in 1993 was Myst. But it seemed that entering 1993, the entire world was Doom crazy. Like every issue of most game magazines talked about Doom in one way or another. I'd never seen anything like it. We cranked out Doom 2 in 8 months for happy fans and new ones who had heard of the shareware version. And I worked with Raven Software to make Heretic and Hexen medieval shooters. And one thing I do regret was not getting a handle on merchandising back then. We had so many characters in our games that could have been turned into t-shirts and plushies and many other items. And nowadays, there are many companies that are selling game merch for all kinds of games. So we spent the next grueling 18 months working on Quake. It was a tough game to make, but after its release, we advanced the first-person shooter again. The game was completely 3D. This is back when there were no GPUs or hardware systems to draw 3D scenes. While working on Quake, we were also working with NVIDIA and other companies to define the future pipelines and feature sets of 3D graphic cards that were coming. For the first time, we had internet multiplayer instead of only LAN and modem choices. And so back to Quake, gaming magazines before and after Quake's release were full of articles and commentary on it. And it was recognized by PC Gamer in their top 50 list, just like Wolfenstein 3D and Doom. This time it was for internet multiplayer, full 3D, mouse look as part of 3D FPS gameplay, and having to help birth Machinima. But Quake is the game that broke the company, and I made the decision to leave in January of 1996. It was tremendously difficult to release Quake. After 7 months of crunch mode, I alone uploaded the game to the world on a Saturday. And so, like a mutual divorce, both sides are ready to split, and I left on August 6th of 1996. This was also the year of Diablo and Tomb Raider. Those are two hits that continue to live 2 decades later. So after leaving it was a very challenging and strange time because while I was feeling down about leaving, everything in my life was getting more exciting. After Quake, I left and co-founded Ion Storm with my friend Tom Hall. And within days of leaving, I had several big game publishers wanting to work with me. I decided to start a new company with Tom 8 months earlier, so I spent several months flying around and talking to publishers to figure out who would be best for next company, Ion Storm. And during our 5-year run, Ion Storm released a couple of great games. We made 4 games at Ion Storm, and my biggest taste of failure was with Daikatana. We released a decent real-time strategy game named Dominion that unfortunately came out just after StarCraft did. Anachronox, which is Tom Hall's Western version of Final Fantasy VII, which was really great, and Deus Ex. So Warren Spector and Harvey Smith's mixture of a first-person shooter and an RPG with really great player choices and multiple narrative paths. Deus Ex was released in 2000 and was awarded the Game of the Year by several magazines. So after Anachronox was released in 2001, IDOS shut down Ion Storm's Dallas office. Tom and I had to figure out what we were going to do next. So we decided to co-found a new company to pursue the new mobile and wireless gaming space. In 2001, this company was called Monkey Stone Games. This was 5 years before the iPhone was released upon the world. So the tech back then was a real hassle to program because there were so many different phones, and making one game work on multiple platforms was a lot of work. Sometimes those screen sizes were off by just 1 or 2 pixels even. Soon enough, Jamdat was acquired by EA for $650 million. The mobile industry was beginning to explode. Games rapidly went from WAP to J2ME to Brew, But the real explosion would happen 5 years later in 2006 with the introduction of the iPhone. So we kept Monkey Stone running for 5 years, and we had a bit of fun with it. But World of Warcraft had come out in late 2004 and was quickly dominating the MMORPG space. I played Ultima Online when it came out, and I saw the insanity of EverQuest hit everyone around me. But until World of Warcraft, I didn't see the hook. So in 2005, I co-founded an MMORPG company so I could make a really big MMO for kids with stealth math learning in it. We eventually decided to call this company Gazillion Entertainment. I learned a lot developing a game this big with an internal team of 100 people. MMOs are really hard to launch. So after 4 years, we had to stop development due to a major limitation of the technology that we had licensed. We had to lay off most of the team. This was another big failure. I spent 10 months not working on anything. I was watching the rise of Facebook's casual gaming, and I thought it would be a really important market to get into. I tried to convince Gazillion to enter the space, but eventually the board of directors decided to stay focused on MMORPGs. So I left Gazillion to do some consulting with a small social app company in San Francisco. After working for less than 3 months, I shipped my first Facebook game with a small team of 12 people. The game is called Ravenwood Fair, and it had astounding success immediately. Within 6 months, the game was being played by 25 million players every month. I put the skeleton of Frontier Jack from Zynga's Frontierville game in the dirt on the loading screen. I learned a lot about microtransactions and monetization models and what makes people want to spend money like that. And because of the success of Ravenwood, I co-founded a social game company with my wife Brenda, and we named the company Loot Drop. In no time at all, we had 4 games signed up by 4 publishers. We hired 40 people to fill the teams. And eventually, after a few years, the social game bubble burst, and we put Loot Drop on ice. And then we decided to move to Ireland and start Romero Games on the West Coast in Galway. We've been going for 8 years now as indies. And now before I move into the future, I want to talk about some patterns I've seen in the industry since the beginning. Who here uses Steam to download games? Yeah. Well, the only difference between using Steam and downloading games from a BBS in the old days is that the speed has gone way up. We have repeated the pattern of digital distribution from the 80s into a faster, sleeker model. Another interesting note is that the RPG company that I got my first industry job in, it's called Origin Systems. It was bought by EA in 1993 and eventually was shut down in 2004. And then EA is now using that same name for their own digital download storefront that competes with Steam and EA Game Store. So it looks like the origin cycle is repeating in a different manifestation. And the next pattern is multiplayer gaming. When computers entered the home, games became overwhelmingly single player. For as long as people played games, they've mostly been multiplayer. Chess, checkers, pretty much all board games, card games, etc. Baseball, basketball, football. Games have always been multiplayer, but until now, with the new home computer, they're single player. And Doom came out at the right time, when local area networking was emerging and modems were everywhere. Doom broke the single player spell of the previous 20 years since the start of the computer game industry. So the next pattern is esports, which depends on multiplayer having been popularized, obviously. Following the release of Doom, LAN parties became popular. People began lugging their huge CRT monitors and huge towers to their friends' houses for a weekend of deathmatch. And after Quake in 1996, team-based deathmatch tournaments got really big. Clans formed, and real competition began with cash prizes. And several leagues sprung into existence. The number of people attending CPL events were in excess of 5,000 people. And most of these people brought their own computers to these events. And Quake was the prime game used in esports for years, and then it shifted to Counter-Strike. This is a League of Legends tournament. So guess what? Esports started in the 80s with the arcade boom. There were arcade tournaments for years with cash prizes given away to the big winners. If you've heard of the movie King of Kong, you might remember that a couple of the main players met at a 1982 arcade tournament. Tournaments were happening everywhere back then. The official scores were kept on the Twin Galaxies website, and they still are kept on that website. So the next pattern is story in games. Games are mainly stories called adventure games. And they always had puzzle elements in them. And recently, the question of what is a game has surfaced. Computer games are not games according to people who played D&D and board games back in the 70s. And then console games aren't games, according to computer game players of the 80s. And there was a huge issue when the C was dropped from the Computer Game Developers Conference, and it became the Game Developers Conference in 1999 to include all platforms, not just computers. So as we expand the boundary of games, people wonder, they question whether it's a game at all. Is Gone Home a game? Is Life is Strange a game? And is Her Story a game? I think they are. When we push the boundaries of games, when we experiment with the medium to see what it can do, there are always those who will question if this new work at the edge is actually still within the boundary when it has, in fact, just pushed it. The next pattern is violence in games. Games are only the latest form of media to be blamed for violence. Comic books and heavy metal and many others were attacked before video games were. While games were entertainment, they're also very much about war and conflict practice. Chess, for instance, and war games arose out of this. Governments have been investing in game-like technology for over 40 years. Dungeons and Dragons spawned its own outcry. Death Race 2000 heralded the loudest outcry in the 70s. But it was followed by Mortal Kombat and Night Trap, and of course my own games. And in a case of incredible timing, the day after the congressional hearings on video game violence in the United States, we released Doom on December 10th of 1993. I believe games, however, are cultural, and I believe that the violence that we see in the world goes beyond games. Plenty of countries play games. Germany, Canada, Japan, England, they're all hardcore consumers of games, yet we don't see similar outbreaks of violence in these countries. It's not the game, it's the gun. It's not the computer, it's the culture. It's not the player. So let me change to my last topic. Where are we going in the game industry? So currently there's incredible interest and investment in AI technologies. And it seems that everyone is building AI tools and trying to find interesting ways to integrate AI into games. And right now, AI-generated art is the subject of a class action lawsuit since the data that the AI is using is sourced from billions of internet images. The lawsuit may prove meritless as the data stored after the process is not representative of any scanned images. And besides, copyright law allows art styles to flourish. Artists have always been allowed to learn from artists who preceded them. Augmented reality has immediate and wide-ranging applications if seen through your phone's camera. And Apple's just entered the AR/VR arena with their own Vision Pro headset that has a tuning knob that varies the mix between full AR and full VR. Apple released ARKit in 2017 and believes AR is the more obvious and accepted other reality that people can handle. Apple has not announced a VR kit. The bet is on augmented reality. For game developers, it's treated as another platform, the way mobile, desktop, and console are other platforms. And mobile gaming gets more incredible each year. There's constant experimentation with how 3D games can best be played on a smartphone. And Capcom just announced their latest Resident Evil Village game that was exclusively on console is now available on iPhone 15. And now you can play any Xbox game instantly on your phone without installing it, thanks to xCloud technology. The future of gaming is streaming as the internet gets faster. There are other incredible new technologies on the way that I can't mention due to NDAs. And games are getting more social, which is where they find really huge success. Combine new technologies, new design, and multiplayer, and amazing things will happen. Procedural generation is going to reach a more impressive level as programmers and designers discover more advanced techniques using machine learning. And procedural generation of object meshes will be moving over to GPUs to generate all the objects that you see in a game, such as rocks and terrain. This is already in development. AI-driven narrative for characters is on the verge of being in games. Soon you'll be able to play a game with characters that you can talk to through your microphone and get responses spoken to you with the content of their spoken lines fully generated by AI, as well as the voices used. Narrative designers will specify the special knowledge that these characters know about and what they don't know about, and let the AI handle what to tell the player. So you'll be able to hold full conversations with characters in a game that the designers never wrote or probably anticipated. There's so many jobs in game development that AI can help with. We are all using AI so much now in development, and it's just begun. The very real future of game jobs will not be how skilled you are at doing your job, it will be how good you are at using AI to help you do your job. This will be true for many jobs in the world. Start learning how AI can help supercharge what you're doing and start learning how it works. The world has already changed. I still believe that games have to have great design to be successful, designs that AI is not able to invent yet. And tech by itself is not enough, but great tech combined with great design is a huge win. And what does all this great technology and design mean? Well, it means what it's always meant. We're going to continue to have even more amazing games, games that we would never have dreamt of playing even 10 years ago. The future of games is very bright indeed. So thank you for having me here, and I think it's time for questions if anyone has any.